Welcome to a video lecture on modification and termination of a trust. I have posted PowerPoints to the course page for you to look at as we work through this lecture. Now let's start first with a discussion of the power to modify or revoke. And when I say the power to revoke, I include the power to modify or the power to amend. Historically, in most states, trusts were presumptively irrevocable. And this, of course, has started to shift with the Uniform Trust Code, the UTC adopting the default position that trusts were presumptively revocable. The state of Nebraska has also adopted the stance that trusts are presumptively revocable. As far as how we go about revoking a trust, any method permissible by law is allowed as long as the trust instrument does not specify otherwise, meaning we are going to respect or facilitate the words of the trust instrument. If method of revocation is limited by the trust instrument, we will respect that. If the trust instrument is silent as to permissible methods of revocation, any method of revocation permitted by law will be allowed. Usually we need a written instrument with an expression of settler's intent. Let's talk now, moving to PowerPoint 2, to modification or termination when we have the agreement of the beneficiaries. The general rule is set forth on PowerPoint 2. It is known as the Claflin Doctrine. Most jurisdictions will allow for modification or termination of a trust if two prongs are met. First, all beneficiaries consent, and second, modification or termination does not interfere with the material purpose of the trust. Now let's set this aside for one moment and talk about modification or termination when the settler agrees, which does make things infinitely easier, because if the settler has joined with the beneficiaries, we no longer worry about the material purpose of the trust. In most jurisdictions, even when we have an irrevocable trust, a trust can be terminated if, first, the settler consents, and second, all beneficiaries consent. That means all beneficiaries, so anyone with a beneficial interest in the trust. And it is worth noting here that a trustee does not have a beneficial interest in the trust. If there is a spendthrift clause in the trust, it will not prevent termination if these two prongs are met. If the settler joins in and all the beneficiaries consent, the presence of this spendthrift clause is not relevant for us. Now, if these two prongs are met, as I said a moment ago, we are not at all concerned with regard to the material purpose of the trust. The joinder by the settler has sort of absolved us of any responsibility to look at that. Now, what about the circumstance when the settler does not join in the request to terminate the trust? That is when we go back to the Claflin Doctrine. The Claflin Doctrine, we need all the beneficiaries to consent, and modification or termination of the trust cannot interfere with a material purpose of the trust. So let's take those two prongs one by one. First, all the beneficiaries must consent. This means all the beneficiaries must consent. So even if there is a remote, contingent, unborn beneficiary you need consent, which you obviously cannot get. The second prong, material purpose. It's great when the material purpose of the trust is expressed on the face of the instrument. It's not always or often the case, but it's great when it is, when we can just look at the trust instrument to figure out what did the settlor have in mind when creating this trust. In most circumstances, a court will look at the language of the trust instrument as well as extrinsic evidence surrounding circumstances to figure out what the material purpose of the trust is. Now, if the settlor has established the trust to protect a beneficiary from his own mismanagement or his own lack of judgment, it would contravene a material purpose of the trust to terminate the trust. And so that is a circumstance where termination is not likely to be allowed. And interestingly, when there is a spendthrift provision in a trust, the spendthrift provision is viewed as manifesting a lack of confidence in the judgment and managerial abilities of the beneficiaries. And so spendthrift provisions are definitely a problem with regard to trying to get a trust terminated. Let's now work through some examples, and I have included those examples in the PowerPoints. First, we have T creates a trust to pay income to A for life, remainder to B. A and B want to join together to compel a termination, and there is nothing in the trust instrument that explicitly states T's purpose in creating the trust. In this circumstance, the inference is going to be that the material purpose of the trust is to provide for successive enjoyment of A and then B of the trust property. We will, in most circumstances, see a court allow termination when A and B both join together in this type of trust, as long as there is no spendthrift provision in the trust. And part of the reason for allowing termination in this circumstance is that the court does not allow termination. A can simply transfer her life estate to B, and then B holds all of the property, and the trust is a non-issue and easily terminated, because successive enjoyment ceases to be an issue then. Looking at the next example, T creates a trust to pay income to A until A is 30 years old, and then to distribute the remainder to A, the sole beneficiary. Should A be allowed to petition for termination before A turns 30 in this case? And the answer is no, because the primary purpose of this trust is going to be deferring A's enjoyment of property until a designated time, until age 30. And so to allow a termination would be in direct contravention of the material purpose of the trust. And our final example, T creates a trust to pay income to A for life, remainder to B, and thereafter B dies, leaving his remainder interest to A. In this case, A is probably going to be allowed to terminate. Once again, what is the purpose of the trust? It's to allow for successive interest in trust property by A and then B. At the point in time all property comes into the hands of A, successive enjoyment becomes a non-issue. And so there is no contravention of trust purpose to allow that trust to be terminated. What about the role of the settlor in terminating an inter vivos trust? Let's talk about that. And I want you to note that the settlor has no interest in terminating a testamentary trust, because with a testamentary trust, the trust does not come into being until the settlor is dead. So we are going to limit our discussion to the role of the settlor in terminating an inter vivos trust. If all the beneficiaries join, what happens when the settlor objects to the termination of the trust? Can the settlor stop the termination of an irrevocable trust? And the answer to that is possibly. Possibly. It's not an absolute. It's not certain that the settlor's objection is going to prevent termination. The settlor's objections are going to be relevant to the court in figuring out what the trust purpose is. And of course, there's probably no better source with regard to determining trust purpose than the settlor himself. But it's not dispositive if the settlor objects. It is just relevant. What about termination of a trust by its own terms? So as a general proposition, a trust is going to terminate if there is a duration of time set forth in the trust instrument, so as designated by the settlor. If nothing is specified in the trust instrument, the trust is going to terminate when the settlor's purposes have been accomplished. And clearly, if there's no property in the trust, the settlor's interests or purposes have been accomplished. What about judicial power to terminate or modify a trust? So a court can terminate a trust prior to the time that is fixed in the trust instrument if the trust purpose is accomplished early, or if the trust purpose becomes illegal or impossible to carry out. We do have here on the final PowerPoint the doctrine of changed circumstances. A court may authorize or direct a trustee to deviate from the administrative terms of the trust. It's sort of an implied rewriting. If two conditions are met, if first, compliance with the terms would defeat or substantially impair trust purposes, and if the settlor did not think about or anticipate the new circumstances. So some unforeseen circumstance has arisen. This can happen. There can be a change in financial status. There can be a change in the tax law. There can be a change in investment opportunities. Especially with multi-generational trust, there may be something that just was not considered when the trust was drafted. An example involves the trust with the World Telegram newspaper. The trust provides that the stock was to be put, very successful newspaper, by the way, that the stock was to be put in trust for the family. The trustee is directed not to sell. The stock value declined over many, many years, and a court finally approved the trustee's application to sell the World Telegram stock. Now, it is worth noting with regard to the doctrine of changed circumstances that a court cannot change the beneficial interests of the beneficiaries. Doctrine of changed circumstances, when applied, will only allow deviation from administrative terms of a trust. And with that, it concludes our discussion.